15 names came up the Hudson River in the winter of 1710, packed into open boats behind a fleet of transport ships, and most of the people carrying them were already dying. Herkimer, Klock, Zimmerman, Weaver, Fox, Bellinger, Petrie, Snell, Walrath, Failing, Countryman, Shafer, Ehle, Loucks, Nellis. They sound like old New York now, the kind of names stitched into county histories and cemetery gates from Columbia County to the Mohawk Valley. But every one of them started somewhere else, in a language nobody in New York spoke, carried by a group of refugees so large and so desperate that the English government did not know what to do with them. If your last name is on that list, or close to it, this is not a coincidence. This is a paper trail that starts on the Rhine River in Germany, crosses to a tent camp outside London, and ends on a patent of land along the Mohawk River that still bears the family names of the men who signed it. Some of those families never made it that far. The ships alone killed hundreds of them. What survived is written into subsistence lists, church registers, and a patent document from 1725 that historians and genealogists still use today to trace exactly which family stood where. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why 15,000 Germans left everything they owned in the spring of 1709, you have to understand what had already been done to the land they were leaving. The region was called the Palatinate, a patchwork of small states along the middle Rhine, fertile, densely settled, and directly in the path of every army marching between France and the German states. During the 9 Years' War in the 1680s and 90s, King Louis XIV of France ordered a scorched earth campaign against the Palatinate, meant to deny the region to his enemies. Entire towns were burned, castles were dynamited, vineyards that had taken generations to establish were cut down to bare ground. The region rebuilt, as it always had, and then the War of the Spanish Succession dragged French and Allied armies back through the same valleys in the early 1700s, and the destruction started over. Then came the winter that finished the work the armies had started. The winter of 1708 into 1709 is remembered across Europe as the Great Frost, one of the coldest winters in 500 years of European weather record. Rivers froze solid enough to drive carts across. Fruit trees split down the trunk from the cold. Seed grain froze in the ground before it could sprout, which meant the following harvest failed as well. A population already stripped by war now faced starvation on top of it, under the rule of a Catholic elector who taxed his largely Protestant subjects heavily to rebuild his own court. For a Lutheran or Reformed Palatine family working land that had been burned twice in 20 years, there was very little left to lose. The first sign that England might take these refugees seriously had already arrived a year earlier. In 1708, a Lutheran pastor named Joshua Cokerthal led a small group of roughly 40 Palatines across to England and on to New York, where they settled a short distance up the Hudson, near a bend the Dutch had long called Quasaic. Cokerthal's group was tiny compared to what followed, but it mattered enormously, because Cokerthal wrote home about what he found, describing the soil, the climate, and the terms of settlement in language enthusiastic enough that copies of his account, real or embellished by others who copied it, began circulating through Rhineland villages, already desperate for any reason to hope. Some historians trace the rumor of a royal golden book promising free land in America directly back to garbled versions of Cokerthal's letters, passed farmhouse to farmhouse faster than anyone in London could correct them. Word had been moving through the Rhineland for months that Queen Anne of England was offering something close to salvation. English agents and pamphlets, one of them later nicknamed the Golden Book, described free land in America, freedom of religion, and passage paid by the crown. Whether the promises were ever that generous barely mattered by 1709. Families sold what they could not carry, packed the rest onto boats down the Rhine, and by the time they reached Rotterdam they were part of a movement so large that no government agency in Europe had ever managed anything like it. Roughly 13,000 Palatines crossed to England that year. London had never seen a refugee crisis of that scale, and it showed almost immediately. Camps of white canvas tents went up on Blackheath and in Camberwell, south of the river, housing families who had walked and sailed hundreds of miles only to sit in a field outside a foreign city with no clear destination and dwindling English patience. London's reaction split almost immediately. Charitable subscriptions raised money and bread for the camps, while pamphleteers on the other side attacked the refugees as an invasion of foreign beggars draining English resources, printing cartoons and broadsides that mocked Queen Anne's government for inviting them in the first place. The refugees themselves picked up the label their English hosts had already started using, the poor Palatines, a phrase that shows up in official correspondence, private letters, and the title of at least one contemporary pamphlet defending the Queen's decision to shelter them. Between charity and backlash, the English government had roughly a year to figure out what to do with 13,000 people camped within walking distance of Parliament, and the solution it eventually settled on was simply to ship them somewhere else. The English government did not know what to do with 13,000 foreign Protestants camped on the edge of its capital, so it began sorting them. Roughly 3,000 were sent on to Ireland, where some of their descendants remain today in what is still called the Irish Palatine community around County Limerick. A smaller group, several hundred Catholics among the refugees, was sent back to Germany, since the whole project had been sold in England partly as a Protestant rescue, and Catholics did not fit the story being told to Parliament. Roughly 3,000 more were bound for Carolina, where a group under a Swiss nobleman named Christoph von Grafenried would found the town of New Bern, and close to 3,000 were assigned to a scheme cooked up by the incoming governor of New York, a Scottish soldier named Robert Hunter, who had a plan to put them to work. Hunter's plan is the reason these particular 15 names ended up on the Hudson instead of somewhere else, and it is worth understanding in detail, because the plan itself is what shaped 3 generations of Palatine family history in New York. The Royal Navy needed a steady supply of tar, pitch, and turpentine, collectively called naval stores, to waterproof its wooden ships. England normally bought these from Scandinavia at prices that rose every time Sweden and its neighbors went to war, which in the early 1700s was often. Hunter proposed a solution: settle the Palatines on pine forest along the Hudson River, put them to work producing naval stores, and have them repay the crown for the cost of their transportation directly out of the profits. On paper it looked efficient. In practice it required several thousand farmers, most of whom had never made tar in their lives, to become an industrial workforce almost overnight, on land that had not yet been fully surveyed for the job. Making tar from pine trees was not simple work, and it was not the work most of these families had spent their lives doing. Traditional naval stores production meant cutting a box into the base of a living pine, letting the resin bleed slowly over a full season, then slow boiling it in earthen kilns until it reduced into usable pitch, a process Scandinavian tar makers had refined over centuries. Whether the Hudson pine stands were even the right species for the job is a question historians still argue over, since some correspondence points to pitch pine, a workable but inferior source next to the Scots fir favored in the Baltic trade. Others argue the trees mattered less than the money that ran out within 2 years. 10 ships sailed from England for New York carrying the Palatines assigned to Hunter's scheme. Close to 3,000 people crammed below deck for a crossing that should have taken 6 to 8 weeks, and in several cases took closer to 6 months due to weather and delay. What happened on those ships is documented in ship logs, in Hunter's own correspondence back to London, and in the burial records kept once the survivors reached New York. Typhus, called ship fever at the time, moved through the crowded holds. By the time the fleet reached New York Harbor, roughly 470 of the passengers who had left England were dead, and many more arrived too sick to work. The ships anchored off Nutten Island, now known as Governor's Island, where the sick were quarantined and where more of them died before ever setting foot on the mainland. A New York City street still carries the memory of that landing. The area where many of the healthier survivors were temporarily housed became known informally among the Dutch residents as Palatine Ground. Hunter's own letters to London from that summer described burial parties working daily on Nutten Island, and he pleaded for money to buy coffins and medicine faster than the Colonial Assembly was willing to approve it, a crisis that shaped how bitterly he would later write about the families he had been sent to resettle. The families who survived quarantine were moved roughly 100 miles up the Hudson to 2 settlement camps established on land Hunter had negotiated, most of it leased from the Livingston family, who profited handsomely from provisioning the operation. East Camp sat on the eastern bank of the river, in what is now Columbia County, near the present town of Germantown. West Camp sat across the river in Ulster County, near Saugerties. This is where the surname record becomes concrete. Hunter's government kept detailed subsistence lists, tracking exactly which families were owed rations and how many people stood in each household, because every ration issued was another debt added to what the family owed the crown. Those lists survive in British colonial records, and were compiled and published in the 20th century by the historian Walter Allen Kniddle in a 1937 study still cited by genealogists today. A separate and equally important source comes from a Palatine named Ulrich Simmendinger, who eventually returned to Germany and in 1717 published a register naming the families who remained in New York, household by household, a document genealogists now call the Simmendinger Register. Between the subsistence lists and the Simmendinger register, a researcher today can trace a name like Herkimer or Weber or Fuchs sitting in a specific camp in a specific year, years before that name ever appears anglicized in an English deed. A third layer of the record comes from the church itself. A Lutheran pastor named Wilhelm Christoph Birkenmeier arrived to serve the Hudson Valley congregations in the mid-1720s and kept careful German-language books of baptisms, marriages, and burials for the Palatine churches at West Camp and the surrounding settlements. Records so detailed that genealogists today refer to them simply as Birkenmeier's registers. Where Hunter's subsistence lists show who was owed a ration, and Simmendinger's register shows who remained in the colony, Birkenmeier's church books show something the government records never bothered to track: which children were born to which parents, in which year, under which original spelling of the family name, before English deeds and county clerks began softening those spellings into something easier for an English-speaking court to write down. The Naval Stores scheme collapsed within roughly 2 years, and it collapsed for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the Palatines themselves. Governor Hunter had been operating on credit from London, expecting reimbursement from the Whig government that had approved the original settlement plan. In 1710, the Whig government fell and a Tory ministry took power in England with far less enthusiasm for an expensive refugee resettlement project on the other side of the Atlantic. Funding dried up. Hunter, deeply in debt personally, could no longer supply the camps with the provisions the families had been promised in exchange for their labor, and the pine stands along the river, whatever their quality, were not producing tar fast enough to make up the shortfall on their own. By 1712, families at East Camp and West Camp were, by their own accounts and by Hunter's furious letters about them, on the edge of starvation again, this time in the colony that had promised to save them from exactly that. What happened next is the part of this story that turns from an administrative failure into a genealogical event, because it is the point where several hundred Palatine families made a decision that put them permanently outside the plan Hunter had built for them. Years earlier, before the camps had even fully failed, representatives of the Mohawk Nation had approached the Palatines and offered them land in the Schoharie Valley, roughly 40 miles to the west, land the Crown had in fact promised the Palatines back in England, but had never actually granted once they arrived, since Livingston and Hunter's associates had quietly claimed much of the surveyed land for themselves. In the winter of 1712 and 13, without permission from Hunter, groups of Palatine families began walking overland toward Schoharie through deep snow, following old Mohawk and Schoharie Creek trails, guided in part by Mohawk families who had befriended them at the camps. Among the young men on that overland march was a teenager named Conrad Weiser, whose father had, a few years earlier, arranged for him to live for a winter among the Mohawks, specifically to learn their language, an arrangement Weiser later described in his own memoir written as an adult. That choice, made out of desperation by a Palatine father trying to give his son one more tool for survival, put Conrad Weiser on a path that would later make him one of the most important diplomats between colonial Pennsylvania and the Iroquois Confederacy, a role built directly on the trust and language he first learned as a Palatine boy on the Schoharie frontier. Local histories of Schoharie County, compiled in the 19th century from surviving family accounts, describe the Palatine settlers there organizing into several small villages the Germans called Dorfs, including one remembered as Weiser's Dorf and another as Fox's Dorf, informal settlements that predate any legal survey of the land they sat on. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Schoharie families did not accept the uncertainty of their position quietly. According to local histories of the county compiled from surviving family accounts, a delegation of 3 Palatine representatives, among them men remembered in those records as John Conrad Weiser, Gerhard Walrath, and Hartmann Windecker, traveled all the way back across the Atlantic around 1718 to petition the Crown directly for the land the families had been promised years earlier in England. The trip took months, cost money none of them had to spare, and produced no immediate resolution. It is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that these were not passive refugees waiting on colonial charity, but organized households willing to cross an ocean a second time to defend a claim on paper against men with better lawyers and closer ties to the governor's office. The Schoharie settlement was not the end of the story either, and this is where the family names on that opening list start to separate and specialize, each branch carrying a slightly different version of the same migration. The Schoharie Palatines had settled the valley without a legal patent, working land under an understanding with the Mohawks that carried no weight in a colonial land office. Speculators with better political connections began pressing claims to the same ground through the 17-teens and early 1720s, and Palatine families who had already been displaced once from the Hudson camps now faced losing their farms a second time to men who had never worked the land at all. Petitions went out to the governor's office. Delegations traveled as far as London to press the Palatine claim directly to the crown, and while some families in Schoharie managed to secure clear title and stayed, a substantial group made yet another move, this time further west into the Mohawk Valley proper, to a stretch of river bottom the Mohawks called the German Flats. This third and final resettlement is the one that produced the clearest legal record of all, because in 1725 Governor William Burnet issued a formal land grant along the Mohawk River to a group of roughly 92 Palatine patentees, a document now known as the Burnetsfield Patent. Unlike the informal dwarfs of Schoharie or the desperate subsistence lists of the Hudson camps, the Burnetsfield Patent is a clean, dated, notarized legal instrument, and the names on it read like a roll call of the 15 surnames this story opened with. Herkimer is there, so is Zimmerman, so is Petrie, so is a name recorded as Walrath that would later settle into the modern spelling Walrath. This is the document genealogists point to when a family today wants to prove a direct, unbroken line back to the original 1709 emigration, because it names a living head of household on a specific parcel of land, cross-referenced against baptismal and marriage records kept by the Reformed and Lutheran congregations that followed the Palatines to every one of their settlements. The physical trace of that settlement did not stop at paperwork. Within a few years of the patent, the German Flats congregation built a stone church on the south side of the Mohawk River, later known as Fort Herkimer Church, which doubled as an actual fortification during the wars that followed and still stands today, one of the oldest buildings in the Mohawk Valley still used for its original purpose. Its cemetery holds headstones carved in German script for families whose names, a century later, would appear in English on militia rolls and tax lists spelled in ways their own grandparents would barely have recognized. It is in the gap between these records, the German-language church books and the English-language land patents, that the anglicizing of these names actually happened, and it happened unevenly, family by family, sometimes within a single generation. Herkimer softened into Herkimer within about 2 generations, partly because English-speaking clerks writing land records and court documents simply spelled the name the way it sounded to an English ear. Weber, the German word for weaver, became weaver outright, a direct translation rather than a phonetic drift. Fuchs, the German word for fox, became fox the same way. Shafer held on to something close to its original sound and became Shafer or Shafer, depending on which county clerk was holding the pen that year. A name recorded in early German-language church registers as Kunstmann, or a close variant, eventually appears in English-language deeds as Countryman, a transformation genealogists still debate, since it reads partly as a sound-alike drift and partly as a deliberate softening of a name that marked its bearer as foreign in a colony that had grown less patient with German speakers as the decades passed. Not every name on the list changed the same way, and the differences tell you something about how uneven this softening really was. Klock kept its German shape almost untouched, since it was short enough and phonetically simple enough for an English clerk to write exactly as he heard it, likely derived from the German word for bell. Snell followed a similar path, close to its original German spelling and meaning quick or swift, requiring barely any adjustment at all. Ehle and Loucks drifted further from their German roots, contracted and resettled into new spellings over several generations of local pronunciation until the families themselves would have needed the church register to recognize the original form. Nellis followed the same slow drift, a name that genealogists still trace back through multiple spellings in early Hudson and Mohawk Valley records before it settled into the form carried by families today. That impatience is worth naming directly, because it is the mechanism that pushed families toward Anglicizing in the first place. The Palatines had arrived as refugees under royal sponsorship, which bought them some initial sympathy, but by the 1730s and 1740s, English and Dutch neighbors in the Mohawk and Hudson valleys increasingly treated the German language, German church services, and German surnames as marks of a separate and slightly suspect community, one that kept its own schools, its own Reformed and Lutheran ministers, and its own dialect for generations after the first ships landed. Land deeds required English spelling. Militia rolls, tax lists, and court appearances rewarded a name that read easily to an English-speaking clerk. Over 3 or 4 generations, without any single law or order forcing the change, a name like Herkimer simply stopped being written that way in any official document a family's children would ever see, and the German original survived mainly in the church baptismal book back at the original congregation, if that book survived fire, flood, and the passage of 200 years at all. The clearest surviving proof that Palatine identity did not simply dissolve quietly into the English-speaking landscape comes from the one moment when the Mohawk Valley's German-descended families were called on to prove exactly who they were, on a battlefield rather than in a land office. In August of 1777, a British and Loyalist force, accompanied by Iroquois allies, marched into the Mohawk Valley toward Fort Stanwix, and the colonial militia that rose to meet them at a ravine near the village of Oriskany was drawn overwhelmingly from the Palatine-descended farm families of German Flats and the surrounding settlements, families whose grandparents had walked out of East Camp in Schoharie 2 generations earlier. The militia was led by a general named Nicholas Herkimer, grandson of the same Johann Jost Herkimer, whose name sits on the Burnetsfield patent of 1725. Herkimer was shot through the leg early in the battle, and according to accounts recorded by soldiers who survived it, propped himself against a saddle under a tree and continued directing the fight, smoking his pipe, while the battle around him became one of the bloodiest engagements, by percentage of casualties, of the entire Revolutionary War. He died several weeks later from the wound. The valley his family had helped clear from wilderness, the land his grandfather had been granted as a landless refugee, had by then produced an American general whose name the county itself would eventually carry. Herkimer did not lead that militia alone, and the names beside his on the muster rolls belong to the same families this story has followed the whole way from the Rhine. The Tryon County militia that marched to Oriskany was organized into 4 regiments, and 2 of their colonels carried names already familiar by then in every camp record and church book along the river: Jacob Klock, commanding the Palatine District Regiment, and Peter Bellinger, commanding the regiment raised from German Flats itself. The ambush at Oriskany killed or wounded a large share of the men who marched into it, by some estimates close to half the militia engaged, and the survivors buried their dead in the same valley their grandparents had walked into as refugees, with nothing but a Mohawk escort and a promise from a governor who had already failed them once. Herkimer County itself, carved out of the old Tryon County in 1791, carries the anglicized form of that first Palatine patentee's name on every map printed since, a small and permanent piece of evidence that requires no archive visit at all. Descendant and genealogical societies dedicated specifically to Palatine ancestry still meet today, cross-referencing modern autosomal DNA matches against the same Burnetsfield patent names, the same Simmendinger entries, and the same Birkenmeier baptismal records this story has already named, looking for the exact document that turns a family legend about German ancestors into a sourced, dated line back to a specific ship, a specific camp, and a specific ration list from the winter of 1710. Some of these congregations held on to German as a language of worship far longer than most people realize, well into the 1800s in a handful of rural Mohawk Valley churches, a thread of continuity stretching directly back to Birkenmeier's own services 2 centuries earlier. What finally broke that thread was not a colonial land office or an unfriendly county clerk. It was the First World War, when German language instruction was pulled from public schools across New York, and German-language church services were quietly dropped or switched to English in community after community, as families with names like Herkimer and Bellinger and Klock, 4 and 5 generations removed from the Rhineland, found it safer and simpler to let the last visible marker of that original identity go. By the time the war ended, the language was gone from nearly every one of these communities. The surnames were the only piece that survived, because a surname on a deed or a gravestone does not require anyone to keep speaking it out loud. The camps themselves never disappeared from the map either, even after the families who built them scattered west. East Camp grew into the town now called Germantown, its name a plain, unhidden marker of exactly who settled it first, still standing on the eastern bank of the Hudson in Columbia County. West Camp kept its name outright, a small hamlet within the town of Saugerties in Ulster County, close enough to the river that a visitor today can stand roughly where the ration lines once formed and look across the same water the 10 ships anchored on in the winter of 1710. Neither place advertises the mortality crisis that founded it. Neither needs to. The name on the road sign does the work the archive would otherwise have to do. What remains of the original 15 names is not a single dramatic discovery, no DNA percentage that rewrites a family's understanding of itself overnight. It is instead a paper trail that most descendants never think to follow past their own grandparents, a trail that runs backward from a modern mailbox in upstate New York, through a 19th century family Bible, through the Burnetsfield patent of 1725, through the Schoharie dwarfs that no map ever formally recognized, through hunters' subsistence lists at East Camp and West Camp, through a quarantine station on an island in New York Harbor, through 10 overcrowded ships, through a tent camp on Blackheath, and back to a burned and frozen stretch of the Rhine Valley that a family fled with almost nothing in the spring of 1709. The names softened along the way. Herkimer became Herkimer, Weber became Weaver, Fuchs became Fox, but the households did not scatter into anonymity. They are named, one by one, on documents that still exist, in archives that still take visitors, under a river that is still called the Mohawk. So look again at the names: Herkimer, Klock, Zimmerman, Weaver, Fox, Bellinger, Petrie, Snell, Walrath, Failing, Countryman, Shafer, Ehle, Loucks, Nellis. If one of them is sitting in your own family tree, or close enough to make you wonder, the record that would confirm it is not lost. It is sitting in a patent from 1725, in a register a homesick Palatine published in 1717, and in the subsistence lists a broke Scottish governor kept, because every ration he handed out was a debt he intended to collect. The name is the doorway. The document is the proof. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.